Thanks, Noelle. I'm Mary Purdy, and shall I share my screen? Does that work?
Yes.
Okay.
Mary, before you start, I just want to make one more reminder announcement for folks who may not have heard it earlier. Just if you know the number of your group, which I know some people might be confused, and you can post in chat if you're not sure and we can let you know, but it's helpful to rename yourself in the Zoom. So with your number first, and then your name, and then your preferred pronouns. Yeah, there's just a few people who haven't had a chance to do that. Thank you.
Thanks. And Noelle, will you just let me know if something goes off with being able to see my screen? I'm assuming you can see the slideshow right now if I put it in a slideshow.
I see it right now. I'll let you know.
Okay. How is that?
Perfect.
Okay. So will you just let me know? Just say something if anything is off.
Okay.
And I just need to try and get everyone's photos out of the way here so I can see here. So again, my name's Mary Purdy. I'm one of the organizing collective members, and I'm also a dietitian. So food has been my life, specifically for the last 15 years. And we're going to be talking a bit about food systems and you. I call this a mini primer because, as you know, if you've done even 10% of the reading over this course of the summer, this is an enormous, enormous subject. So I don't pretend to try and cover every single component of this in this 10-minute presentation, but I will wanted to at least just share some information with you all. And I encourage you to continue the conversation in the chat as I go through this. I'll be able to see some things, but maybe not everything. So what is the food system? And many of you may already be super familiar with this, but let's talk about what it looks like. So essentially the food system is how we produce food, how we harvest it, how we transport it, distribute it, process it, sell it, consume it, and ultimately, unfortunately, waste it. So within each of these words, there's so much involved. So production, is obviously that can be farming, that can be agricultural techniques. Harvesting can have so much, so many other broader definitions. How we transport it, how we distribute it, whether it's sold, whether it's given away, whether it winds up in food banks. Lots and lots of components of this, but these are some of the basics. So the resources that go into this system are absolutely tremendous. So we've got our land, obviously, where the food is being grown, or the food for the food that we will be eating, like the corn and the soybeans for the cows that are very often fed these foods. The soil that's being utilized over and over again to produce these crops. There's water that's necessary to make sure that these crops are staying hydrated, the energy that goes into all of the production, from the tractors to the water that maybe utilizes energy and electricity to be utilized, fuel and the gas that transports the various food from place to place, the chemicals and the input, and this can be anything from fertilizer to pesticides and all kinds of herbicides that go into the production of food in our agricultural system. Then, of course, there's the labor of the people who are growing it, but harvesting it or transporting it. And then, of course, there's packaging and plastics that go into the processing part of the food. So what influences it? What affects our food system? These are just a few. So the resources are huge, obviously. The culture that we come from, the worldview that someone might have, the social values can have an impact on the food system, how that food is produced, how that food is distributed, access to this food, location, what actually grows food well, where are people able to access the food that is being grown. Finances obviously play a huge role. Marketing, think of the way that food is marketed to certain individuals, whether that is people of lower socioeconomic status, people of color, children. How is that food marketed? Economics, obviously, when we think about things like agribusiness and the consolidation and the mergers that we read a lot about this past week or two. Education, and that includes people's education about food itself, whether it's good for you, whether it's healthy, whether it comes from a place that is not supporting environmental practices or eco-friendly practices. Policy is tremendous. We know that food policy plays a huge role on how much people have access to, what farmers have access to land-wise, what's being subsidized, what's not being subsidized. And then there's racism and discrimination, which run rampant in our food system, again, from food production to food consumption to food waste, what is available to people and why. And this includes things like food deserts or food apartheids, where people of color tend to live in places where they have less access to healthy food and are much closer to convenience stores. And that is not necessarily unintentional. It's about consumer demand. And this is also where you can come in and really have a strong voice, which we'll be talking a bit more about later. Climate change has affected, is affecting, will continue to drastically affect our food system as well, making things less accessible, making the land less viable for growth, and having a huge impact when it comes to things like drought and floods. And then COVID. We've seen that COVID has peeled back the layers of the dysfunction of our food system. And I'm curious from your perspective, what else, either in your personal experience or just from an intellectual or philosophical point of view, do you think affects or influences the food system? Feel free to chat about that in the notes there. So I think, and I might just take a quick look if I can see some of the things that people are saying. Looks like I can't do both here.
I can read. Yeah. Let's see. Heather said, when thinking about food production, we should be including fishers and oceans too, an even larger part of the planet than land-based food production. And Leah had said nutritional guidelines, but I guess that falls under policy.
Yes, perfect. I'm so glad you mentioned fisheries. I knew there'd be things in this presentation that I wouldn't think to add. It sort of it comes, you know, in your head. You think fisheries are included in everything, but absolutely that's not land for sure. So very often people are working to make this food system more sustainable. And what does this mean? This is just one definition. A sustainable, and I'm adding in this resilient food system, conserves and renews natural resources. It advances social justice and animal welfare. It builds community wealth, and it fulfills the food and nutrition needs of all eaters now and in the future. Now, again, this is just one definition. We can build on this. We should be building on this to allow more inclusion of the various issues that we are seeing and have seen as it relates to biodiversity and ensuring food sovereignty and addressing issues of racism. So this quote comes from Frederick Kirschenmann, which is sustainability is a process. It's not a prescription. Therefore, no simple definition. It's a journey that we are embarking on together and not necessarily a formula that we agree to. So this idea of sustainability really needs to be flexible for all of us. And really, it's sustainable enough. If we think about the food system as it is, what do we want to sustain? We got a lot of issues. I'm not interested in sustaining the drastic dysfunction that is so apparent in our food system. So the word sustainable and the idea of sustainability really should be more of a bridge. And our destination is the regenerative that we've been talking more about. This is more holistic, it promotes health, it involves more resilience, it is fair, it is just, it is economically balanced. And again, that could be interpreted in a myriad of ways, depending on whose economics you're talking about, and then transparent as well. So regenerative agriculture is something that you probably have been reading about, and maybe you have participated in it, or maybe you have read a lot about it on your own. But this is something that really builds health into the system, and it starts and really focuses on the soil, which is such a critical piece, not just for the benefit of the land, but ultimately when soil is healthy, people are healthy, the land is healthy, and that is going to have a huge impact on human health, but also planetary health. So regenerative agriculture, it minimizes disturbances. So there's less fertilizer, there's less pesticide, less tilling of the land, which is very disruptive to the soil. It maximizes crop diversity. We know there's a huge monoculture issue going on, which really has a huge impact on the resilience of the land and the ability to fend off pests. The diversity of the crops also helps to feed the soil. We want to keep those crops covered, which helps to keep the soil alive. And it also makes sure that not just the popular crops are being used, but there are constantly crops that are being used that are taking the carbon out of the atmosphere and feeding it to the plants. and that we're maintaining roots in the soil. So it's not just the top of the soil that's really important, but making sure that there are roots that are still growing, regenerating, creating microorganisms and a whole ecosystem underneath the land. And then integrating livestock. This is an important part that I think people often don't realize can be such an integral part of the culture of agriculture, and making sure that we're using livestock in a humane way that actually helps to stimulate new growth and act as fertilizer. So one of the things that I like to focus on in my professional life is the way that the global food system is having a huge impact on greenhouse gas emissions. So it's almost getting up to 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions that come from the global food system. And again, there's different opinions about what the exact percentage is, but we can say it's somewhere between 1/4 or to 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions come from the food system. And 15% of those approximately are coming from animal production, which is actually more than the entire transportation sector, which we know is also a critical component of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. But it's interesting to think that a large portion of these greenhouse gases are coming from animal agriculture, specifically industrial animal agriculture. And so when we're looking at some of the environmental effects of our agricultural system, there are a lot of really problematic issues. As I mentioned, 1/4 of those greenhouse gases come from our global food production. We are using land in places where we are actually destroying the benefits that those lands are offering to different cultures, as well as making sure that, or basically destroying the ability of the land, whether it's the Amazon rainforest or other arable land that is protecting, either creating shade or creating a space for indigenous cultures to live and thrive. We use tons of water in production. There's all kinds of acidification of our global waters, our oceans, and then a minimizing of that biodiversity, which is so key for life. So additionally, this agricultural food system that we have, this industrial agricultural food system, pollutes with chemicals from pesticides, as well as numerous other components of machinery and fertilizers. And it also, of course, as we've been learning so much about, has a real disregard for food sovereignty and indigenous practices and land. So as a dietitian, I very often am focused on diets and the effect that the foods that we are eating, the foods that we are growing, have on those greenhouse gas emissions. So you can actually see when we're looking, again, this is industrial agriculture, not folks who are raising animals maybe in a humane and regenerative agricultural way. But you can see here, this is from a great site called Our World in Data that takes a look at how much either whether it's processing or transport, the impact of certain food groups have on the greenhouse gas emissions. So if you look right here at the top, really one of the biggest greenhouse gas emitters is the production of beef, lamb, and dairy here. So unfortunately, I hate to say it, but chocolate and coffee are right below those. So this doesn't mean never eat chocolate or coffee again, but it is something that we need to be taking into consideration as we make our purchases as eaters and consumers. So you can see as we go all the way down that the foods that tend to be much lower on that carbon emissions list here are things like the grains, the tomatoes, cassava, soy, peas, bananas, vegetables, apples, nuts, and beans are also quite low on this level. So the good news around this is that if we're looking at this at a health perspective, or from a health perspective, the foods that actually have the best health benefits, or I should say maybe the least disease promoting benefits, are the foods that are also lower on that carbon footprint. So the more we can encourage and consume foods with that lower footprint, which are those more whole foods, less animal foods, the more we are helping to promote eco-friendly practices in our agricultural world. So as I mentioned, we need to shift how we are farming, the way that we are producing, because it's having a huge impact on the earth. And right now, the system that we have is unsustainable. As you probably know, we are using resources much more quickly than they are available to us. We're having lots and lots of negative impacts on the human health system as well as our ecosystem. We're dependent on fossil fuels, on these chemical inputs, and we are mistreating our indigenous farmers. We are underutilizing the cultural knowledge, the traditional practices of indigenous cultures and Black farmers and Latino farmers who have a great deal to offer when it comes to practices that really support the earth and are working in concert with nature as opposed to against it or benefiting from it. So the other thing that's important for us to note is how much food we're wasting. So I have a question for you all, that if you can put this into your chat as well. What percentage of food do you believe that we waste? 10%, 20, 30%, or 50%? If you're guessing, I'm about to give you the answer in the interest of time. It is 30%. This is food that is lost and wasted, both by us, by restaurants, by caterers, by farmers. And this is actually because of the methane gas that these produce that contributes to about 8% of our total greenhouse gases. So this is a huge area we can also take charge. So we know that a healthy food system relies on all of these things, like a healthy person who needs sleep and stress management and healthy food. A healthy food system also needs to be aware of the land and reducing food waste and focusing on more plant-based diets and soil health and this regenerative and organic farming practices. Food sovereignty, agroecology, livestock issues, being mindful of chemicals. So agroecology really is about redesigning this agricultural system. And I know Heather will talk much more about this. So where do you fit in? What can you, my friends, do? These are just a few ideas, and I really hope that you will feel inspired to add your own, or maybe choose one of these to focus on this week. So eating more plant-based, demanding better quality meat and humane livestock practices, supporting agroecology, supporting regenerative agriculture and organic practices. Talk to your farmer and buy from your local farmers. Support those community and school-based gardens, the CSAs. Seeking out and buying from smaller brands as opposed to the big ones. You'd be super surprised to find out that Kevita, that lovely fermented beverage, is owned by PepsiCo, that Lara bars are owned by Coca-Cola. So speak up and support those who may not have a voice, whether that's farm workers, farmers, other people in your community. Waste less food. If you can compost, great. Buy less packaged food. Cook more, great thing to do while we're all stuck inside a lot more frequently. Be political. Contact your representatives about local issues, federal issues, from subsidies, things that we are paying for that are not ultimately serving us from a health or environmental perspective. Educating yourselves, as you all are wonderfully doing around these issues right now. Plant a garden, connect with your food. What is it like to eat a cherry that came from a tree that you grew or that you grew in a community garden? And lastly, join these social movement organizations like CAGJ to help build power and support those who are in need of additional voice and power. Thank you so much.
Woo! Thank you, Mary.
Woohoo!
Awesome.
Now we're going to move on to Heather's presentation on our program at CAGJ called AGRA Watch.
Okay, I'm very uncertain of how the share thing works, so let me know. Okay. So I need to be able to see my notes. What do you see right now? Is it right?
Yes, I see your presentation.
It's big enough.
Yes.
Okay. So that was fantastic, Mary. I am going to give some more background to the part of work, CAGJ's work that we're focusing on this month, which is the solidarity with the African food sovereignty movement. But first, I just wanted to put that into context. So, whoops. So, the mission, we've actually updated CAGJ's mission or purpose recently. So the new the new one that we're actually like announcing at this membership meeting that's coming up is to strengthen the global food sovereignty movement through popular education and mobilization. So there's multiple strategies for changing the food system. That's how I think of these movements. As you know, food sovereignty was first coined in 1996 by La Via Campesina, a global social movement led by peasant farmers. It's very powerful, has membership all over the world. And food sovereignty is really about democratizing our global food system. And it recognizes corporate control and monopolies, like what we've been reading about this week, as really central to how our current food system is broken. It's guided by 7 core principles that are from reorganizing trade to ending the globalization of hunger. Food sovereignty means that communities should have more control over food access and production than profit-driven corporations. So it really centers power. Food justice was coined in the US in the early 2000s and was really led by urban communities of color, like in Oakland and in Brooklyn, who are organizing to address health disparities and recognizing that limited access to healthy food is a key factor contributing to really high rates of disease and hunger. The term now refers to many facets of the movement for a healthy food system, but generally, food justice has been characterized as transitioning or reforming the food system, whereas food sovereignty offers a more systemic critique and is aimed at transforming the food system. That being said, like there's 2 members of the US Food Sovereignty Alliance in Washington State. So ourselves and Community to Community, which is a farm worker group in Bellingham, and we both use both terms in our work all the time. Food First said, "We are the arms and legs of the same food movement." Food security as a term and approach has been in usage longer than food justice and is the dominant approach of international development and institutions like the United Nations or World Bank. It is an approach to ending hunger that doesn't challenge the status quo. Community was added to food security as a way of moving more towards food justice. I love that when you Google food sovereignty, this image comes up, which is a poster and a volunteer made for a conference that we did when we started working on food issues. So this declaration, which was part of our resources last month, is kind of the foundational document for understanding food sovereignty. So CAGJ has 3 programs. And as you know, each month of summer school, we were focusing on a different one. And this month is focused on our AGRA campaign, so I'm going to talk about that more. But we also have our Food Justice Project. There you see food justice showing up. And then our historical work of trade justice, because we came out of the 1999 protests against the World Trade Organization, which this image is from the iconic WTO protest image. So we started the AGRA campaign 12 years ago in 2008, specifically because we're based in Seattle. I'm just seeing there's some stuff in the chat. Is there anything I'm doing wrong that I could fix for folks?
Just trying to get your presentation to be full screen. It seems like you're showing us
if you go to
toolbars and stuff.
Play from current slide on your top left corner, Heather, and then it left to the middle right there, and then that will make it bigger.
Yeah,
there.
See, the problem then is I can't see my notes.
So then we'll share the slides
And
after.
that's fine.
Can somebody else share it? It says you can do side-by-side mode under view options.
And I would just go back to what you were doing, and we'll share the slides after this. We're also recording, just so we can get through our time schedule.
Sorry, I was afraid this would happen. Sarah also has it and could share it, but
Sarah there.
I don't know what to do. Should I just keep going?
Sarah, I can share if you'd prefer.
I'm also looking to pull it up right now and might be able to share it if I can get it in the next moment, which I think I will.
Yay, go team.
Okay, I'm gonna stop share and I'm just gonna keep going through my notes. And hopefully you'll have some images to go along with this in a second. So I was saying that we started AGRA in 2008, and it's specifically because we're in Seattle, and also it's because of a relationship we have with some Kenyan farmers who kind of raised the alarm for us. And this photo is from an action we did in 2016 when the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa won the Food Sovereignty Prize, and the head of AFSFA, Bern Gurry, came from Ghana, and we did an action at the Gates Foundation headquarters. So the next slide, what is AGRA? It's the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. It's a multi-million-dollar initiative of the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation actually funds agricultural development through multiple programs, including global health. So AGRA Watch isn't really correct. We should call it Gates Watch, but we realized that kind of too late. So AGRA promotes agricultural development oriented for the markets of transnational corporations and big agricultural industries. And many in the African food sovereignty movement call this neocolonialism because it's prioritizing Western interests over farmer self-determination. By calling it a green revolution, they're referring to the green revolution that took place in the 1960s to test chemical fertilizers in the global south. And that whole program was based on the belief that the solution to hunger is increasing production. But that model failed. It destroyed land because of chemical inputs and left millions of farmers in long-term debt. And if you watch the video about suicides in India, that's direct outcome of the Green Revolution. Nevertheless, AGRA is a second push for a Green Revolution in Africa. And as a private actor, the Gates Foundation has huge, just disproportionate influence on governance systems and policies. And one of the things they're trying to do is make it easier for genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, to replace staple crops. And in the process, traditional seed saving is being criminalized. So AGRA secures Africa basically as a resource pool for the global north, because that's where the transnational corporations are based. And we call this philanthrocapitalism, which is when philanthropy is used as a means for profit under the guise of some presumed social good, but it doesn't take into account the concerns and solutions from the communities that it intends to help. So in the next photo, this is why we say food sovereignty is the solution and stop the failing green revolution. And this is a social media action that we did at our SLE dinner one year. So the next slide, this is just what AgriWatch actually does. So we organize solidarity with African farmers and activists. We monitor, research, and publicize their investments. We educate community. We mobilize action and have a lot of fun doing that at the headquarters of the Gates Foundation because we often get media. And then we put a big focus on changing the narrative around hunger and poverty in Africa. The next slide just shows a lot of the partnerships that we have, the organizations that we work with. Just for time, I'm going to keep going to the next slide, which shows some photos that our former organizing director and AgriWatch coordinator Simone Adler took. One of our most important partnerships is with Kenyan farmers who practice agroecology. My husband and I were able to visit this project, Grow Biointensive Agriculture Center of Kenya, or GBAC, in 2008 or 9, I think. And Simone just went back in 2018, and then we were able to bring them to Seattle last fall as well, which is really amazing. The next slide. CAGJ is really proud to, so more pictures from Kenya. So this photo is from a gathering of the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa in 2018 in Senegal that 3 AgriWatch members participated in, and it was at that meeting where we became a member of AFSFA. It's called Friends of AFSFA membership, which is a big honor. There's only a couple of groups outside the continent that are members. So what we're really focusing on right now is the strategy of narrative shifting, and the field trip, quote unquote field trip, that we're doing for this month of summer school is this webinar where we're launching a report that we are publishing that's about the Cornell Alliance for Science, so based at Cornell University. They've received over $12 million in funding from the Gates Foundation, and they run a program to train fellows that are usually like communication experts, but also in other fields from around the world. But the majority of them are African, and they train them in how to effectively be proponents of agricultural biotech propaganda, really. They're propagandists. So they train them in a pro-GMO narrative, and they train them in how the whole Cornell Alliance for Science is kind of based in the, if you criticize biotech in any way, you're anti-science. And they directly coordinate with transnational corporations like Monsanto and DuPont. And their narrative work also specifically targets agroecology and specifically aims to discredit and devalue the practice of agroecology. So the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa called for a response to the recent efforts of the Cornell Alliance for Science, and that's why we developed this report. And it's a case study of one of the fellows, and it also includes an overview of the Cornell Alliance for Science and their connection to the Gates Foundation. And then we have a second report coming out as well, just happens at timing, that the president of AGRA, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, was just appointed to be the leader of an upcoming UN Food Systems Summit, which will take place next September. And there's been a huge, like 500 organizations have protested this, saying that it's like co-opting a space where agroecology has been getting a lot of attention and being uplifted by the United Nations processes. And it's like decades of work that have led to that. And this is seen as an effort to co-opt and undermine that organizing that has happened. And there was a letter that 12 people signed, and as opposed to 500, but 12 people supported Agnes Kalibata, the president of AGRA, to take this position. And AGRA Watch analyzed all of those signers, and as the report is showing that they're all, except one, are funded directly by the Gates Foundation. So we're just trying to demonstrate the power of the Gates Foundation.
Give me a 2-minute warning.
So the last slide is just that, you know, strengthening the food sovereignty movement means engaging in several membership-based organizations and alliances and coalitions. CAGJ is most active in the U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance, which we helped to found, and National Family Farm Coalition, which I'm really proud that our membership in that coalition makes us members of La Via Campesina, because we're a member of the North American branch of La Via Campesina. And parts of our effort to develop leadership is to participate in these spaces. So I just want folks to know, like, if you're interested in getting more involved in the food sovereignty movement and want to get involved in CAGJ, like we try to bring people to these organizations' national assemblies, and we host their events. And there's also ongoing collectives that you can participate in. So I'll share more information about that in the future. That's all.
Yay. Thank you, Heather. And thank you, Sarah, for sharing the screen.
Thank you for helping figure that technology out.
So in the interest of time, we're gonna like dive right into our next presentation, which will be me, Sam, and Lisa. Okay. Working. So our presentation is called Crisis Convergence and Globalized Food Systems. So since we can't take questions, in the interest of time, we want you guys to discuss these thoughts, any thoughts you have with your small group after this. So flag any interesting thoughts that might come up and any questions you might have to discuss in your breakout rooms. In The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, author and activist Naomi Klein exposes how global free market policies are not so much democratically chosen, but are in fact imposed and controlled by big money and powerful interests, who often use crises to further consolidate global dominance. And as you guys know, we're living in a time permeated by crises, from COVID-19 to climate change to growing corporate power and intensified racial and economic inequality. We hope to show today that food justice and food sovereignty work is not separate from these seemingly divergent issues, but through food, we can actually come to understand more deeply the intersections and relationships of power and crisis, which shape and are shaped by our global food system. And while we could spend endless time connecting so many different dots, today we're just going to try to cover a few main points we're hoping everyone might consider more deeply this month. So now I'm going to pass it off first to Lisa to help us untangle some of these webs. Is Lisa there?
Hey, sorry, thank you. Thank you, Noelle, for the introduction. And before I start, I want to welcome everyone to, if you feel like it, to add additional points as I'm presenting, just because the summer school is about collaborative and popular education. So I want to hear your thoughts. So yeah, for this slide, we're going to examine how racism and economic inequality are linked to, exacerbated by, and are perpetrated within our food. Understanding how racism and classism serve to prop up capitalism is foundational in our understanding of the food system. All right, so to go into it, first of all, the legacy of plantation economics persists today through the maltreatment of essential food workers. From the phenomenon of tipped wages to the poverty wages of migrant farmhands in a food system so consolidated, cutting worker payroll is a guaranteed way to boost profit. Furthermore, large-scale farmers exploit the threat of deportation and replacement as leverage to neglect fair wages and adequate living conditions for their undocumented and H-2A visa workers. The exploitation of the working class and people of color in the food chain follows racial and economic stratifications. The poverty inflamed by low-paying jobs, such as farming and serving, entrenches those workers within pre-existing inequities caused by structural racism and classism. For example, farm workers, and especially farm workers of color, are paid poverty wages, fixing them in food insecurity. This, while farmland is overwhelmingly owned by whites but worked by people of color to this day. The consolidation of food corporations means that fewer and fewer dictate prices, terms, flow, and lobbying power to keep poor communities reliant on cheap food and big pharma. Concentrated corporate agriculture profits from food apartheid by administering both the cause and the treatment to diet-related illness. Globally and locally, poor folks and Black, Indigenous, and people of color suffer higher rates of hunger, food insecurity, numerous environmental injustices, including agrochemical exposure and diet-related illness from industrial food production. Examples are hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, and obesity. These complications implicated in these illnesses are economical, physical, and mental. And when they're met with a highly infectious virus, those that suffer these illnesses find themselves immunocompromised, which leads me to our next crisis, COVID-19. So the rates of COVID-19 hospitalization for people of color and Black people is on average 5 times higher than it is for whites. Immunocompromising conditions stemming from diet are in part caused by the systemic absence of nutritious, culturally appropriate foods that are available to the global poor and oppressed. COVID-19 is amplifying exploitation of labor and the imagined hierarchy of value along the food chain. It's revealing the asymmetry in the food system, in that those who are most essential in our food system and who are now considered frontline workers are paid the least, such as those who work in meat packing and produce packing plants, farmers, and grocery store workers, etc. While those profiting get to work in the safety of their own home. COVID-19 is also exposing the vulnerability to and dependence on global free trade for basic necessities, increasing global food insecurity. Lastly, some epidemiologists are arguing that our increased encroachment of natural landscapes, such as through industrial food production, is increasing the prevalence of zoonotic disease. Reckless industrial agriculture practices have paved the way for and created a society totally unprepared for a pandemic. For example, industrial agriculture is responsible for mass deforestation, shrinking the habitat buffer between humans and wild animals that carry zoonotic disease. And on the topic of deforestation, I'm going to hand it over to Sam to discuss climate change. Thanks.
small topic. Here we go. So we're going to zoom in to another key force of this web, and that is climate change, or rather climate crisis. And so one of many things that we know about climate change is that it is fueled by industrial food production. Mary told us some of the numbers on this, and we know that industrial food production is causing deforestation, emissions from industrial input and machinery, transportation, processing, packaging, refrigeration, waste, all of these different processes, and they're also leading to the degradation of ecosystems in favor of these enormous monocultures that are more susceptible to disease, have less biodiversity, and even yield less nutritious food, which Mary told us so much about. And climate change also exacerbates the racial and economic inequality that Lisa just told us about by reducing arable land in the global south, increasing global food insecurity, making people more prone to outbreaks like COVID-19 and to the effects of them. And all of this results in decreased resilience to increased climate chaos, where peasant farmers and oppressed communities become more vulnerable in disasters such as floods and fire and drought. And so while we're well aware that burning fossil fuels and destroying carbon sinks that are forests and wildlife sanctuaries causes dramatic changes to climate, unprecedented climate events then become more common and more extreme. And so as this intensifies, the individuals most harmed by those changes are not going to be the millionaires of Silicon Valley or the billionaires of Bellevue, Jeff or Bill. And even though their houses might still crumble in a mudslide, it's the farmer who was told that transitioning to new modern styles of agriculture would pull them out of poverty, and then only to have their farm washed away in a landslide because the soil had become so degraded, who's going to benefit, or who's going to be harmed the most by these changes. And just because climate chaos is this global phenomenon, it doesn't mean that we're all in this together or even remotely equally. And that's a very familiar narrative that is also emerging around COVID and the racial and economic disparities that are emerging when something big happens to everyone, but it does not happen equally. So that parallel is also important. And so all that instability from climate-related impacts is only going to drive more and more, and is driving mass human displacement. And so what do you do when all of your economic opportunity is tied to the land and then the land gets destroyed? Or when volatile governments leave food systems to fend for themselves in a free market and then there's nothing to eat? Of course you leave. And so we'll return to that aspect in a short bit, but for now, let's pivot to looking more closely at the sprawl of industrial food production. So industrial food production relies on and promotes corporate consolidation. And so we've read a lot about this, about mega mergers and mega firms owning most of the world's agricultural capacity. And we also know that those dominant firms are too big to feed humanity sustainably. And waste and inequality are inherent in those systems. And they exacerbate climate change by disincentivizing and sabotaging traditional food systems, leading to land, water, and climate degradation, as both Heather and Mary and everyone has already explained. So we've been over that. And these mega-scale corporations, the only way that they can keep prices low and control the market in the way that they do is through exploitation of labor, and creating markets with just such high barriers to entry. And so we see this in seed laws and patents, companion genetically modified seeds, fertilizers, and pesticides that don't work unless you buy into the whole set. Essentially creating systems of indentured servitude at best and slavery at worst by locking farmers and farm workers into cycles of debt. And all of this may be funded by philanthrocapitalism, by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and AGRA under the guise of development, or as a solution to feeding the world, where hunger is framed as an issue of production, that it can be resolved by more and more inputs and modernizations and white saviorhood rather than addressing the issue of rigged markets. And so rigged markets leads us to thinking about neoliberal trade policy, which Noelle will tell us more about.
So you may have heard this term before, neoliberalism, but you might not be exactly sure what it means. If you look it up on Wikipedia, neoliberalism is described as ideas associated with laissez-faire economic liberalism and free market capitalism, exemplified through privatization, deregulation, globalization, free trade, austerity, and/or reductions in government spending in order to increase the role of the private sector in the economy and its society. Essentially, it is the global imposition of a single dominant economic order based on so-called free markets, which erode community sovereignty and autonomy. These policies promote agri-food corporate consolidation within the industrial food model by creating incentives for market concentration through mergers and acquisitions. Under this model, businesses have to expand in order to compete on the global economic stage. They also create and recreate structures of racial and economic inequality by upholding the economic dominance of the global north and transnational capitalist class, who are invested in exporting the industrial agricultural model around the world. This is to the detriment of peasant food producers, food chain workers, and eaters worldwide. Also inherent to these institutions is the creation of massive debt among global South nations, whose economies have been opened up for the global market. With their local economies now destabilized, states and food producers are forced to take out loans for development and to compete with extremely low prices driven by industrial economies of scale. And so that takes us to debt. Food producers, both in the United States and around the world, are promised higher yields and more income if they adopt these new industrial agricultural technologies, such as genetically engineered seeds, and the accompanying agrochemicals. But when these tech fixes fail to deliver upon such promises, food producers are left unable to pay back their stacking corporate loans, leading to a crisis of farmer suicides, often tragically by ingesting the very agrochemicals for which they became indebted. And so neoliberal trade policies also contribute to mass human displacement, much like climate change. As mentioned before, the so-called level playing field created by economic liberalization destabilizes local markets, forcing many to seek out better pay and opportunity than is possible at home. Migrants may find work in richer countries in the fields or the slaughterhouses, but their labor is exploited for corporate profit and furthers the consolidation of wealth. This is compounded by climate change displacement, both interrelated fuels adding to the refugee crisis. And some governments, like in the United States, may respond by detaining immigrants en masse, caging and separating families whose livelihoods are directly harmed by the economic policies our country promotes. So as you can see, these issues aren't actually so separate after all. I'm going to pass it to Sam.
Yeah, so
note that we're about 6 minutes past time, so you're probably wrapping up.
We're wrapping up.
Okay.
Yeah, so each of these components has cascading effects and nothing works in isolation, right? So just taking a breath to internalize all this information. With all this info, we can allow ourselves to feel bogged down, or we can choose to see that these are many facets of the same fight, and that our organizing to one contributes to power for the other. And so when we're in the streets protesting for Black lives, when we're redirecting resources to individuals in our communities, raising funds for farm workers, striking in Yakima, abolishing prisons, defunding police, wearing a mask, these are all different facets of this same struggle. And we can let these likenesses inform our organizing and keep us focused on what we're really trying to work against, which is white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, and capitalism, and colonization. And we are affecting this whole web when we pluck the silks and make sure that the whole structure shakes when we address those issues. And so it can feel hopeful. It can feel really overwhelming, but it can also feel hopeful. And just as these enormous entities are connected, so are the acts of organizing and of solidarity and the interpersonal moments that we very much have control over. So this is a lot, and you may have lots of questions, lots of thoughts, and and hold those for just a moment while we take a bio break. And Lisa's going to give us just a little more info on that, but we'll be transitioning into small groups.
Thank you for that, Sam, and thank you for all the information that the presentation, the presenters just gave us. Thank you. So we're going to take 5 minutes to take care of any needs, get a snack, use the bathroom. When you come back, you'll be in a breakout room for about 20 minutes before we come back together for a full group discussion. We are going to have share backs, but not report backs at this time. So keep note about anything you'd like to talk about with the group. Thanks.